Okay, everybody, good afternoon. Political Science 102. Let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to finish talking about federalism, then we're going to talk about the 1900s. Okay, and the 1900s part should be relatively brief, should not be anything too in-depth. We're actually going to touch a little bit on some of the things that happened in the late 1900 to 1910. But that'll be with the progressive era when we talk about Roosevelt, which will be next week. So, like I said, remember you have your exam on Monday. I will open the room up in case anybody needs me, but I don't expect you to be online and me, keeping an eye on you. I don't think we need to do that. So if you need to take it outside the parameters of the normal class hours, just shoot me an email and let me know. If you have any SAS or student accessibility issues, send them to me and let me know, and then we can go from there. So remember, it's going to cover the first 3 weeks from the 24th until today. And then next, kind of where we're headed next is we're going to be talking about the progressive era. Then we're going to get into talking a little bit about things like voting and the electoral college and political parties and interest groups. So that's kind of where we're headed. And I'm kind of glad we are going to probably be back on campus when we start doing some of these talks about interest groups, specifically when we start seeing the amount of money that is being spent in elections and how much money people donate to candidates. And I have a couple of things we could use to kind of reinforce that. Do you all have any questions before we get started? Okay, so one thing that I wanted to show you, this is a handout that I have posted in the announcement section. If you look at this, you could see that we have the powers that are pretty delineated here: federal powers, state powers, and then they also have concurrent powers or shared powers, right? Whether it's taxing or borrowing money, banks, define what is a crime and what isn't a crime. In some instances, some states, have different laws, as we know, right? The only thing that the states can't do are to, establish some type of currency, enter a treaty, run a post office, or even, engaging in trades situations. So there's a bunch of, we kind of define what the federal government could do along with what state governments can do. And I think this is a pretty good handout to take a look at so you can understand it a little bit better. Any questions about this? Okay, so let's go ahead and head back to where we left off the last time. Okay, so obviously one of the big parts of the Constitution is going to be the Supremacy Clause. And remember, the Supremacy Clause is established in Article 6, Paragraph 2, which states that the federal Constitution and federal law will take precedent over state laws and even state constitutions. So that's a very important thing to remember, especially when we're talking about things like the legalization of cannabis, right? So as we kind of detailed in here, the federal government would be well within their rights to come in and shut down the dispensaries if they wanted to. But, they just haven't taken the position, or they haven't taken action on that. And I think we talked a little bit in class last class meeting, where when we really started to see the marijuana laws starting to come into place, and both for medicinal use and recreational use, and how the Obama administration took the position that they were going to not do anything if a state had a democratically initiative in place, which California did. And the Trump administration kind of took a different position, but they never really acted out on it. Jeff Sessions, and this is actually a funny, kind of funny haha to me. Jeff Sessions was the attorney general at the time, a conservative senator from Alabama, who at one time made the comment that he was okay with what the Ku Klux Klan did until he found out that they smoked weed. I think it's kind of weird, you know what I mean? Of all things, you know, racism trumps somebody wanting to take a hit on a spliff or a joint or whatever, right? So again, let's look at our real world example. Prop 64 in 2016 legalized marijuana for recreational use. And I actually really should try to change the terminology that I use. I'm going to use cannabis kind of from now on. Cannabis is this Schedule 1 controlled substance. The Controlled Substance Act of 1970, which happened under Nixon. When we get into talking about Nixon, and we'll have a whole section about Nixon, we're going to talk a little bit about this in more detail. And like I said, if the federal governments wanted to come in to California, shut down dispensaries, they'd be well within their right to do so. So this kind of leads us to what the meat of our lecture here is, the necessary and proper clause. And this is going to be kind of a thing where I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions, and I'm going to want you know, some of you all to kind of give me your view on this, right? So the necessary and proper clause is a clause that is in the Constitution. It was established in a court case called McCullough versus Maryland, where you know, they wanted to create a central bank, which had not been specifically expressed enumeratedly in the Constitution, but it fell within Congress's implied powers, right? So this necessary and proper clause is also known as the elastic clause, meaning that the government can kind of stretch its authority to anything that's not specifically prohibited. So obviously, if you pass a law saying that African Americans need to sit in the back of the bus, obviously you can't do that because that's a violation of the constitutional privileges. But if you want to make an addition to a enumerated power that may need to be refined, you could do that, and you can fit that into the necessary and proper clause, and it'll be legal, right? So we have kind of two terms, the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. It's called the elastic clause because you could stretch out powers, or you could stretch out your definition of these laws to try to fit inside that necessary and proper clause. And the necessary and proper clause is used to maybe add an addition to one of those implied powers. I mean, not the implied powers, but those enumerated powers that are granted to the Constitution. Do y'all have any questions about that? I know sometimes this is a little bit hard to understand, but I'm trying to give you, and we're going to go into a real world example right now, but I just wanted to see if you all had any questions about that. Okay, perfect. So the necessary and proper clause, let's go ahead and move on. So here, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution has said the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. So simply put, Congress has that power to enact laws that help carry out those enumerated powers that we have. Vested is also a key term in here. Vested is kind of a fancy way of saying enumerated, or enumerated is kind of fancy way of saying vesting. Either way, it gives Congress the power to fit a law that they think might help them carry out another law, even if it's not a specific duty that's granted to them. I know that's a lot, but let's go ahead and take a look at the real world example. And then if we have any questions, we can come back. Okay, so if the federal government is going to pass a law and it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, can Congress do that? Yes, if it can be rationalized that what are we doing is to execute one of those delegated powers or enumerated powers. Some critics of this are going to claim that these enumerated powers are pretty broad, right? So we'll go ahead and look at an example. And with this example, you know, Congress has a federal statute that issues a tax. Congress can do this because taxing is an enumerated power. When enumerated power may not be powerful enough to validate a law as constitutional, then Congress can go in and argue that this clause can be used to broaden Congress's authority to enact this law. So just wanted to see you guys are keeping up with me on this one, right? I know this is hard to understand, but we'll get through it. You guys okay?
Yeah. So once Congress is had made the decision to enumerate their power and make a law, does it still have to be checked and balanced by the judicial system?
Yeah,
And
that's a great question. Yeah,
it,
it can be. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. Does that make sense?
so they can just
Meaning,
put a law in, and if no one has a problem with it, then they just insert a new law. And
yeah, as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution,
okay.
right? So, and remember though, some of these constitutional amendments we have can be kind of broad. So you may be able to fit something into that. Yeah, but yeah, it's totally possible.
Why do I feel like making a law should be a lot harder? No?
Oh, you'll see when we get to the legislative branch, you'll see how hard it is.
Oh,
All right. So, give me about a month. And when we go in talking about the legislative branch, I'm going to take you guys through the bill making process, through the lawmaking process, and you'll see how difficult it is. Yeah, but this is kind of a tool that Congress has to maybe push an agenda that might not be specifically addressed in the Constitution, but maybe tied to one of those enumerated powers that we talk about.
yeah, I hear about that they'll put a law in, it'll be like Prop 8 or something, but then there's a semi paragraph, there's a small paragraph within that law that they're actually trying to push through, and it's covered by the entire bill. You
Right.
get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and even when we get into talking about interest groups, you're going to see where there might be times that Congress tries to sneak things in the bill that they don't think people are paying attention. Yeah, and like Madison said, Madison has a good comment in here because, and we've seen a lot of legislation stall in the past few months due to the threat of a filibuster, which we'll talk about when we get to talking about the Senate. But look at these enumerated powers here on the screen. If you can fit an addition to one of those that doesn't violate the Constitution, and you can claim it's necessary and proper so you can carry out that duty, then it's legal, right? Then it's constitutional. So one of the enumerated powers that's not listed on here is the responsibility of the government to provide some type of criminal justice. Right. And when I say justice, it means laws, laws, regulations and stuff like that. So let's take a look at this. Let me bring this in. I mean, this may be dating myself a little bit, but have any of you all seen a TV show called America's Most Wanted? I don't even know if it's on anymore, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I used to watch it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the host is a guy named John Walsh. And John Walsh had a son that was murdered by a repeat sex offender. Okay, so just kind of remember that when we get into this. When we talk about applying the necessary and proper clause, remember, we got to go with that old Machiavellian theory that your ends must justify your means. So the means of this law are appropriate, are reasonably related to achieve the goal of the law, right? So you have to have your ends justifying your means. And then, this is all things that happen when you're trying to apply this necessary and proper clause. So one of the more recent times that the necessary and proper clause was argued was in a case called U.S. versus Comstock. So let's talk a little bit about this. So on the 25th anniversary of the death of Adam Walsh, Congress put into place these tiers for sex offenders, right? So this isn't the controversial part of the law. So what it basically does is it organizes sex offenders into 3 tiers. And, this is pretty common. We hear about this every so often. We'll hear some drama about the government wanting to put a sex offender, who's being released in a certain area, and you have to let the residents know. I don't know if you all know, on the Megan's Law website, there's a website called Megan's Law where you can go in and you could put your address and you can find how many sex offenders live in your area. This is all done by legislation and decisions and voting. And, if you're classified as a sex offender, you have to register with the county that you're living in. Tier 3 offenders are going to have to update their whereabouts for the rest of their life, and every 3 months. So you got to let the government know where you are every 3 months, and you have to do that for the rest of your life. Tier 2 are people that are, 6 months with 25 years of registration. And then Tier 1, it's the least on this whole statute here. Tier 1 offenders must update their whereabouts every year for 15 years. And if you fail to register, then you could be put in jail. All right, let me tell you guys right now, this is not the controversial part of the law. This is all pretty cut and dry, and I think it's a reasonable addition to the statute of how we deal with child molestation. Here is the controversial part. Okay, first of all, let me address the federalism part, and then we'll go in. This is kind of the coercive federalism that we're going to talk a little bit about in a little bit. This act is going to require states to comply with a statutory scheme under which state laws are required to modify the registration systems in accordance with federal requirements. So what this does is it gives the federal government the ability to pressure the states to say, okay, we adopted this tier system, you need to adopt it also. And if you don't, you're going to lose 10% of your law enforcement assistance funding that the federal government grants. Did any of you all, when I was talking, take a look at Megan's Law yet? The Megan's Law website?
Yeah, actually, I am on it. I found someone like really nearby.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
my.
anytime you're moving into an area or you're buying a house, it's always a good idea to check that.
Yeah.
I mean,
whoa.
And then I think you could even go into in more detail and see what the specific charge was.
Yeah, this guy says 288A. How do I something about elusive acts with a I don't know, like
A lewd act, probably. Yeah,
something like, I mean, I don't know, it's not very specific on what happened, but
yeah,
he's a sex.
Well, you'll know the generality, you'll know the charge, you'll know what they were convicted of.
Let me see.
228A says, except as provided in subdivision, a person who willfully and lewdly commits any lewd or lascivious act.
Okay, so that's pretty broad. That could be showing some kid a porno magazine or even touching them. You know what I mean?
It says, let's see here, including the acts of constituting other crimes provided for in Part 1, upon or with the body or any part or member thereof of a child who is under the age of 14, with the intent of arousing, appealing to, gratifying the lust, passions, or sexual desires of that person or child.
That's pretty cut and dry.
Be punished by the state, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So it's that's prepubescent. Yeah. That's
Child molestation. Yeah. About, oh God, it had to be maybe 10 years ago. My son was probably in 3rd grade. No, can't be, because he's in 12th grade now. So, oh yeah. So he's probably about in 2nd grade. And they actually arrested a teacher in the school accused of child molestation. And he ended up he's in jail right now. And I don't think he gets out to 2046 or something like that. And the real scary part was he lived like a couple of blocks away from my parents' house too. So kind of a double whammy there. Okay, so here's the controversial part of that Comstock law that we talked about. What happens, say for instance, we have a person that's convicted of child molestation, they're put in jail, right? They serve their sentence. Their sentence is up. But the federal government still believes that they're a danger to society. What this law does is it gives the federal law enforcement the ability to order the civil commitment of a mentally ill, sexually dangerous federal prisoner beyond the date he would be otherwise released. 18 United States Code, section 4248. So let's talk about this. What do you think about this? Well, before we do that, let me show you. There are, certain criteria that has to fall in, and there is a semblance of due process in this. So a federal judge has to be the ability to civilly commit, and it's going to be a federal judge, probably the prosecutor, probably a parole officer, along with a psychiatrist that does the testing. This person would have to suffer from a serious mental illness, and they wouldn't be able to refrain from sexually violent conduct if they were released. A hearing is available to the involuntary committed individual every 6 months to reconsider the commitment status. So that last part is the due process part. So every 6 months, this person has a review. Madison-Megan's law was basically to have give the public the ability to determine where sexual predators are potentially living. So we know in the area that we're in who to stay away from, I guess, to, so to speak.
I'm apparently surrounded by them.
Yeah. Yeah. And and to be honest, I always, if you see somebody in your area, I would always click on it and make sure it's not like something like urinating in public, because you could be, if you do that, you could potentially be classified as a sex offender as that as well. Even though it's still a pretty disgusting thing to do. I mean, obviously there's going to be people that have that might be on the very fringe, but no, that Megan's Law website really shows some of the baddies that we have here in our society. Okay, let me ask you all this now. What do you think of this law? Good, bad? Now, remember, I'm one of those people that is very much about due process and criminal justice and having people who have violated their law, pay their debt to society. But in this case, I personally, and this is just me, I personally do not have a problem with this. Even though this person has completed their sentence, I mean, how do you know they're not going to go out and do this again?
So I think for me, the issue is I don't see law as preventative. So in other words, I don't believe that it's really possible. I mean, you might be able to say that you can have, you can have some chilling effect by having, a heavy sentence or something like that. But if we're going to go with a generally free society, then you're essentially committing somebody or punishing somebody for something they haven't done yet.
Yeah, I can see that point. And I think that's a really valid point to make. Again, there's no right or wrong answer on this. We're all going to have different feelings on this. But I just kind of want you all to think, oh, is this a good idea, or is this an governmental overreach, or what?
Well, I mean, what if you were to expand it to other things?
Yeah, you could potentially would have to, make another addition to the law.
Sure, but I mean, just from a reasoning standpoint, like you could, I mean, we do that, like say, for example, with when you suspend someone's driver's license, I suppose.
Right.
If you speed enough or are reckless enough.
Or get a couple of DUIs.
But that's not really imprisoning somebody, though. You're curtailing their privileges in public in terms of their ability to transport themselves at speed.
Yeah.
But you're not saying they can't go somewhere.
Right. Or, you're also probably taking the ability away. I mean, obviously, I think there are might be some restrictions on how close you could live to a school or something like that. I wouldn't know that part of the law, but I assume there might be something in there about that. Just like zoning laws prevent, liquor stores or gambling parlors close to schools as well.
What, you mean you lose your license?
What do you mean, like your liquor license, or?
Oh no, were you talking about for one of these offenders, or were you talking about if you lose your license because you've got too many tickets?
Oh, no, one of these individuals, the child molesters.
I mean, we do have a tendency to, I mean, we do have like specific categories of crime that we consider to be especially heinous, right?
Right, and this is one of them.
Yeah. I mean, how does that differ in terms of the way that the law of use? I mean, usually that's done in terms of sentencing, right?
Right.
So if the sentence has been served,
That's the whole question. And like I said, there's not a right or wrong answer. It's going to be based off of how we interpret this. So Comstock had finished his sentence and was to be released. He was incarcerated for 3 years for possession of child pornography. He was not released as he was still civilly committed and still a danger to society. And in a 7-2 decision with Clarence Thomas and Anton Scalia dissenting, they decided that that law fit into the necessary and proper clause. The states thought it was infringing on their police powers, but the federal government basically said, hey, these people are already in our system anyway, so the state law doesn't really matter. I mean, you know, it's a controversial thing to talk about, right? And, you know, I think we could probably come to maybe the agreement that, you know, child molestation is probably one of the most heinous crimes that we have here. And not just child abuse as well. There is a Netflix documentary about a young man, I think a young kid, he was like 8 years old, and it was up in Palmdale. And I actually had to turn it off, where the parents were beating him and torturing him. And LA County's services, family services, or whatever they call it up there, weren't really doing anything for him. The parents ended up in prison doing life sentences. So, I mean, you know, it's just, I always like to talk about this because it shows, you know, a really good view, and it also is a really interesting topic. So remember, this necessary and proper clause is going to give Congress broad powers to enact laws that are rationally related and reasonably adapted to these other enumerated powers. So since one of Congress's enumerated powers is, you know, determining criminal justice, per the Supreme Court's decision, they said that it was available to be able to fit within that necessary and proper clause. Any questions about that? Okie dokie. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the evolution of federalism here in the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of, you know, points in our history where federalism has kind of existed and how it's evolved and how it's changed. And are we taking too much power from the government, or is the government taking too much power from the private sector? We're going to get into that right now. So between 1791 and 1901, we had something called layer cake federalism. And it's just like a layer cake. So you have your bread, or what do you call it? Do you call it bread? Because I'm translating from Spanish. On a cake, what would you call the bread part? You call it the bread, right? I don't know. It's in Spanish, you call it the bread. So you have the bread, then the icing, then the bread again, then the icing, then the bread, then the icing on top, right? So just remember that vision. During the first 110 years of our country, states and nations divided most governmental functions. The national government, the federal government, concentrated on those delegated powers that we talked about in the Constitution, and the states decided the important domestic policy issues. So kind of going through that evolution, we saw something called cooperative federalism, or marble cake federalism. This is where the government's going to provide grants to states or to local governments. Both the nation and the states exercise responsibility for welfare, health, highways, education, criminal justice. So basically what happens is we go to work, right? We get our paycheck. Our paycheck has taxes that are deducted from it. Those taxes that are deducted are then sent to the federal government. And then the federal government will give a grant in aid to other parts of the country that need some type of funding, whether it's law enforcement, school, highways, or whatever. Does this make sense?
Well, so are we talking about the definition of federalism, or are we talking
Yeah.
about federalism in specifically the USA?
In the US, yeah. And we're
Yeah.
talking about kind of the different types of federalism we've had in our history now.
Okay.
So remember, federalism is the division of labor, a division of power between federal government, state government, and local government. Now we're going to look at some of these eras where federalism was treated differently. And when you see the next graphic, this is going to kind of reaffirm what we're trying to see. If you look on the left here, you have your layer cake federalism, where these are programs and authorities that are divided among the nation, state, and local governments. So we could say the first, these are duties that the federal government does, duties that the state government does, and duties that the local government does. This was at the beginning of our country. Now, if we look at this, this is marble cake federalism. So if you ever go down to, actually somebody just gave me one of the marble cake abundance from Nothing But Cakes. Is that what it's called? Nothing But Cakes. It's pretty good.
Nothing Bunt Cakes.
Nothing Bunt Cakes. Yeah. I haven't eaten it all yet.
Play
I
on
eaten
words.
like, yeah, I've eaten like half of it. It's one of, they sell these little mini bunt cakes that are pretty good. I don't need the sugar, but that's why I eat it in pieces. But yeah, it's pretty good. And it's a marble cake. So we look at the marble cake here. All our duties could potentially be shared or mixed among the federal, state, and local government. I'll give you all an example. We all drive on the freeway, right? You guys know the difference between the blue freeway signs versus the green freeway signs when we look at the number of the freeway that we are on?
State and federal.
Yeah. So generally, if you see a blue freeway sign, that means that freeway is going to go through at least 2 states, right? In fact, Interstate 5 goes from the border all the way up to the Canadian border, I think.
Actually, it goes down past into Mexico too.
Yeah.
I think actually I-5 actually might actually go all the way to South America.
Yeah. Yeah. So within that corridor from the border all the way up to the other border, the Department of Transportation is responsible for that freeway, right? So any type of improvements or any type of upkeep needs to be paid by the federal government. But, and here is where kind of the state comes in, the state is responsible for the maintenance of that. So they take federal money, and if there was a pothole on a freeway that needs to be filled, Caltrans, who are those people that we see working in the orange vans on the side of the freeway, not the people on Saturday morning, that's something else, right? But the people that are during the week out on the freeway doing maintenance, those are usually Caltrans workers. And they do the upkeep of the freeway with federal dollars and with state dollars. Schools is another thing. You know, a lot of states get funding for their schools through taxation. They give the monies to the state government. They also can give directives on how the state government uses or teaches as far as curricula. And I know there's a lot of, you know, kind of crazy things going on with, you know, people burning books and talking about not teaching about, you know, slavery and stuff like that. That whole anti-CRT movement that's out there.
There's the don't say gay laws in Florida right now.
Right. Yeah. It's I don't know what some of these people are thinking sometimes.
Wait, Professor, what is CRT?
It's critical race
theory.
Yeah, critical
Yeah.
race theory. It's basically focusing on how slavery was done in the United States and how it focuses on how racism plays in a lot of decisions on how we were originally kind of brought forth in this country, and how, you know, we still have ongoing things with policing and, you know, maybe higher education. It's a focusing on the aspects that kind of illustrate that, you know, there's a history of racism here in the United States.
Yeah, but I mean, we've always known that though.
Yeah, but
Like-
I think one, it may be guilt. There might be some guilt on people.
Oh,
Oh, I don't want to hear about this anymore. And it's probably people that are truly racist as well. Why are we teaching this in school? And if you would ask me as a person who's in education, I think you need to teach it.
yeah, I mean, it's a part of the history. I mean, it's
Part of
that's-
history.
Yeah,
And you know, there's always a saying as those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
yeah.
So I hear a lot of these things. It gets me fired up sometimes. Over the summer, I was out bragging that summer of last year, I was bragging that if the federal government could come and arrest me, I'm going to teach slavery and some of the actions that were taken against African Americans at the start of our country, all the way up until the 60s, when all those Jim Crow laws finally were eradicated. 1/4 Native American, and you know, I don't even want to get into how Native Americans were treated, but we still need to understand that.
Yeah, it's like not forgetting about it, ignoring about
Yeah.
it, and not teaching students is actually disrespectful. Then,
Right.
you know, because just like, you know, yeah, that's how I feel.
And one thing, a part of this, it's not placing blame on
Just-
white people, right? It's just showing that we've had a history where groups have been marginalized. And we need to understand that. So maybe we can understand other people's position and get past that. And maybe truly have a society where we're all equal.
Hmm.
That's just my own personal opinion. Okay, so after that, the 60s, we started to see LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Great Society program, where we started to see virtually all problems were classified as national problems, like the war on poverty. It's an interesting one. And then we kind of see this new style of federalism from 1969 up until now, where, you know, trying to go against, FDR's New Deal took a lot of power from the private sector and gave it to the public sector. So FDR actually expanded the size of government. Conservative presidents like Nixon and Reagan had looked to kind of consolidate that power down and give some of those powers back to the state. And we'll talk about some of the things that they did in a minute. So Nixon felt that general revenue sharing was best determined by state and local governments, as they're more effective at identifying their day-to-day needs. And Reagan was kind of the same way, right? Trying to give state and local governments a little bit of leeway in determining how to use their grant money. Okay, we also have something called coercive federalism or federal mandates. And these are things that are really, really interesting. A federal mandate is going to be a direct order to states and local governments to perform a particular activity to comply with a federal law. These can be unfunded. And a good example of this is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the Americans with Disability Act was an act that was put into place to make places more accessible for persons with disabilities, right? And, you know, we see it every day. Anytime we go out, we see kind of aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Can you all think of anything right off the top of your heads?
For what, an example of the ADA?
Yeah, or an example of something is done as a result of the ADA.
Maybe like handicap parking.
Exactly.
Sorry,
Go ahead. I was just going to say, by the ADA, if you have a certain number of of spaces, you have to allocate a certain number of those spaces for people with disabilities.
Yeah, the width of doors, the height,
Yep.
the toilet paper dispenser is off the floor, the grab bars in public restrooms, the
Yep.
bumps on the little yellow bump strips when you go across
Yeah.
the street.
You know, if you leave Walmart and you hit those, when you have a cart, or it happens to me at Costco, you leave Costco and you hit the cart and it starts vibrating, you're going over those yellow things. Those are bumps that are put in place for people who are impaired, so they know that they might potentially be walking out in traffic.
Actually, the talking, are the talking crosswalk signs, are those ADA compliant, or is that?
I don't think there's so much ADA, they're ADA compliant. I don't think they did it because of the ADA. I think they just did it because it was a good idea. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Because I think it came out after the ADA. And yeah, that is something that fits in with the ADA. And I think it's also a lot of, for convenience as well. So remember, these things aren't funded. So the federal government is not going to give you money to put these things in place. So you have to use your own money. And if you don't do it, if you don't make accessible bathrooms, if you don't have wheelchair access for bathrooms, if you don't have elevators, if you don't have ramps, you're in violation of the Americans with Disability Act. What's going to happen to you? It's going to be two things that are going to happen to you.
You mean
One,
as
you could
a state
potentially
or
be
as an
fined
individual?
as a business.
Well, for starters, the building inspector is just not going to sign off in your place.
Right. But say, for instance, we're in Walmart, right? And it's Christmas time. And well, this might not be a good example because a lot of people shop online now. But say you're at Walmart and there is a situation where a lot of people have gone through there during the day, knocked stuff off. There's clothes in the middle of the racks. Federal law states, or state law states, that you have to make a reasonable attempt every 15 minutes to 30 minutes to make sure these things are cleared. If it's not, you may be in violation. Walmart may be in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, especially if it happens a lot. So like Madison said, you can get fined or you may be facing a lawsuit. And there's actually a guy, I don't know his name, but there's a guy here in San Diego that, and I don't know how to put it. I get the impression that he goes around and looks for issues to complain about and then to sue. I don't know if it's really for the movement or if it's for his own financial gain. But yeah, I mean, you could definitely be facing a lawsuit. Another unfunded mandate was Obamacare, right? Obamacare, the Healthcare Act, that it made states set up insurance exchanges and they make deals with insurance companies. So if somebody isn't able to get healthcare through their work, or if they're self-employed, they can go through the Affordable Care Act and get health coverage through there, right? The unfunded mandate part was there was no money set aside. And again, if you refuse to do it, you could risk losing federal funding. Where was it at? Right here, just like in here, like in the Adam Walsh Child Safety Protection Act. So kind of as that version of coercive federalism, the federal government can pull your funding if you don't comply. Does this make sense? Okay. So let's talk about grants. Grants are, tax dollars that are gotten up, collected, put together, and then given to state and local governments to run programs, whether it's a social service, public health, or whatever. These grants are used for a broad purpose and not necessarily really that specific, right? So you can have a block grant for law enforcement, give it to a law enforcement agency, and they can use it for whatever they want, right? Same with public health, same with social services. These block grants have a lot of flexibility attached to it. Also have categorical grants. These are grants that are for a very, very specific purpose. And I think in the last class, I talked about Head Start. Head Start was created in 1965 as a summer school program to help low-income students catch up before the start of the school year. It's a preschool, right? But there's a little bit more education in it as opposed to babysitting. You know, the teachers have to be certified and all that stuff. The federal government provides money to run this program, but it has to be specifically used for that purpose. So it has to be used for a Head Start purpose. And it's not even for low income people anymore. There may be a tuition attached to it. But when my two kids went through it, the county of San Diego actually had a grant where it was free. So it was like babysitting for free, right? Where you're learning their ABCs, they're learning to socialize. And by the time the first day of school comes around for kindergarten, they're not like thrown in the deep end of the pool, so to speak. So we analyzed the different levels of government here in the US. We talked about the necessary and proper clause. We talked about the Adam Walsh Child Protection Safety Act and how it ties into federalism. We looked at the different periods, and then we defined what a block grant and a categorical grant is. Any questions about this? If we were a public policy class, we would probably really expand on a lot of this. But since we're not, this is all of federalism that we're going to talk about. We're going to actually see a lot of it in progress now. And, you know, just when you are looking at government things, just kind of think about what some of these programs are derived from. Like, it's interesting that we go to work, we have our pay, money gets taken out of our paycheck, goes to the federal government then grants it to a program, whether it's law enforcement, public health, education, or whatever. So I think it's a really interesting, unique situation we have here in the United States where, you know, we have this kind of situation where federal government, local government, and state governments are all involved and work together for some type of maybe a social welfare program. Medi-Cal is a good example of that. Medi-Cal is low-cost insurance here for people that are low income. What you would do is that money to help fund Medi-Cal, it may be known as Medicaid in other states. What happens is Medi-Cal is funded by the federal government, and then they give that money to the state government to help run it. The state government throws some money in as well. The state government's going to determine eligibility and going to determine how people are enrolled. Then they pass those duties on to the local governments. And then the local governments will do the enrollment and check the eligibility. So if you wanted to apply for Medi-Cal, you'd probably have to go to a county office. Same with food stamps or CalFresh or other cash aids as well. Well, financial aid well, financial aid comes strictly from the federal government, so that's probably not a good example. But maybe some type of grant that came through from the federal government to the state government that the community colleges were able to take in. That might be an example. Any questions, comments, or concerns?
Yeah, Professor, back on that conclusion slide, it said something about, Adam Walsh. Yeah, it said, talked about Adam Walsh, and I forgot, how does that tie into federalism? Like, can you go a quick review of that again?
Yeah, absolutely. See right here, remember how we talked about that sex offender list? Well, part of the program said that states have to adopt this same program. And if they didn't, they would be losing their funding.
Oh, so is that how the federal government is able to, do states not have their own taxes, or they do, right?
Well, not every state, like Nevada doesn't, Florida doesn't, Texas doesn't.
So Florida and Texas are completely like dependent on the federal government?
Well, I don't know if what other taxes they have. They may have a high sales tax. I don't know. I haven't been Nevada. I never really noticed. When I like Las Vegas, I mean, I never really noticed any difference in sales tax.
But so, okay, yeah, I
But there's
understand
got to
that.
be other, yeah, and I can look in
Federalism.
there. Yeah, there's got to be other revenue streams that, I mean, probably someplace like Nevada has a lot of revenue from things like hotel taxes. I don't know. The last time I went into Vegas, what probably it was during the pandemic too, and so it was pretty good because there's not a lot of people there. I think they tacked on something like $60 for taxes. That might be another way that they generate revenue in place of a sales tax. I mean,
So
it's in state tax.
my quick question for you. So is this system really based around money and organizing taxes, or is this system like if money wasn't a factor, would we still have this system in place for regulating and making laws and stuff?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Federalism?
yeah. We would still have the system in place.
Okay.
You wouldn't necessarily see the coercive aspects, however.
Right. Yeah, you wouldn't see that last part where we talked about the fines. This part. So if the federal government didn't collect taxes, or didn't have some type of revenue stream, this coercive federalism probably wouldn't be in effect. But this coercive federalism is a big deal because we states really depend on federal money to run a lot of programs. And kind of coming from that, you know, I told you all before I started to do this more often, I work for the county in the HR department. And, you see monies coming in for the sheriff department, grants. You see aspects where, like during the housing market, when the housing market crashed, there was less tax revenue and the federal government was kind of bailing other governments out, state and local governments, by providing money that they were losing from things like property tax. So yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting system that we have. Really good discussion, everybody. Really good. Any questions, comments, or concerns? Because when we come back, we're going to talk about the 1900s, and this isn't going to be as interesting as the Adam Walsh Child Safety Protection Act, but still some things that have happened in our history that is really interesting. So let's come back at 2:35. We'll do the 1900s, and then I'll answer any questions about the exam. I posted the YouTube video of the exam, so take a look at it. And then we'll see you in about 10 minutes, all right? We'll come back in 10. See you guys in 10. Okay, everybody, let's get back at it. Okay, so we're gonna finish up this section of our class by talking about the 1900s, and this is gonna complete the first 3 weeks. And everything up until today will be on the exam on Monday. So this isn't gonna be that long. So we'll finish probably about 15, 20 minutes. And then after that, I can answer any questions that you may have about the exam. Okay, so we're going to see a rise of new industrial elites during this time. So we started to see the first generation of capitalists, right? And they built their empires in pursuit of profit. And remember, we are in a mixed economy here in the United States. So basically, there's 3 types of economies in the world, all right? You have your free market economy, you have a mixed economy, and you have a command economy. The United States has a mixed economy. What does that mean? We, for the most part, have a capitalistic system, but there is government intervention. And, we can talk about it. What are some examples of government intervention in businesses?
Utilities.
Yeah, utilities. What else? What about, if we buy a car, what do we expect it to do when we park it the next day and park it and then come out and try to get in it the next day? We expect it to start, right? So, when you talk
Consumer
about government,
protection.
yeah, consumer protection, exactly. So when you talk about kind of the crux of the system of government that we have is at the very, very minimum, we need some type of protection for the consumer and also some type of protection for the employee, right? So you need to make sure, and this we're gonna see, kind of in the progressive era where workers were being abused, given long hours, little pay, unsafe conditions. We'll talk more about that next week. But for the purposes of this, we're looking at a group of people that are competitively trying to make as much money as they can and trying to practice that idea of social Darwinism, right? So social Darwinism basically is survival of the fittest. The weak are going to die off. And it's really not the government's responsibility to prevent the weak from dying off. That's what a pure market economy would say. That's what Adam Smith would probably say, who is one of the fathers of how the American the American economic system is set up.
Isn't he the invisible hand?
Yep, the invisible hand theory, where we are guided by an invisible hand to perform tasks that match our talent, and that's how we make money. We use that talent to make money. And during this time, we saw about 400,000 patents come through. There's also the best. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say I find it a little bit irritating that now that we're in 2022, we're still sort of generally guiding this and sort of tending to ignore the amount of massive data that we have that actually shows how people actually work. How economics actually works, as opposed to like these sort of, theories that were based on zero data other than just sort of general observation.
Right, general observations was what it was. Yep, you're right there. But for the most part, one of the stuff that really kind of made people millionaires, as an example, is Carnegie. Carnegie had a Bessemer process which converted iron into steel. And we started to see kind of the moving along of American life with steel railroad tracks, plows, bridges, buildings, scalpels for surgeries, sewing machines, and automobiles that were in its infancy. By the 18th, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to start the new slide. So go ahead and say what you're
I
going to say.
was gonna say, like, I don't know if anybody's on Ayn Rand, so I've ever read any of those, but I think that's why the word and steel is featured in that. Was basically, as I understand it, based off of Carnegie and the importance and sort of monopoly that came from that whole thing. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Okay, so by the 1880s, we started to see the value of manufactured goods surpass that of farm products. So we're seeing a movement from an agricultural society to a more industrialized society, right? Where we start having factories, we start having innovations that make things easier to do, especially on farming, right? So there was a lot of capital invested in manufacturing. It went from 1 billion in 1860 to 10 billion in the 1900s. And then we started to see the manufacturing products grow. Also saw railroads developed. Obviously, you can move merchandise, you can move commerce easier now, and you can also move people, right? So we started to see the square mileage increase from 79,000 to about 166,000 in 1890. Also started to see business mergers in this capitalist society, right? You want to minimize your competition. This isn't an economics class, but a lot of things in economics are based off of supply and demand. If the supply is high and the demand is low, your prices are going to be less. If the demand is high and the supply is low, then your prices are going to be high. Have any of you looked on the internet on how much Super Bowl tickets are? Did anybody get a chance to see?
More than I can afford.
Yeah, more than I can afford too. I think I looked earlier on StubHub, which is a secondary market. I think the cheapest ticket I saw was $4,000. Now, why is it $4,000? The demand is high, supply is low. You only have maybe 70,000 of those tickets available to millions of people who probably would want to go. That's just an example there. So the price is set on kind of the balance point where supply meets demand. By the turn of the century, the rise of corporations were a very, very key part of America's industrial revolution. So again, we went from kind of that agricultural society to a more manufacturing, industrialized type of society. Education also was kind of pushed a little bit more. In the 1900s, 15.5 million people attended public schools, up from 6.8 million 30 years earlier. Obviously, there is a population spike as well. But I think a lot of people were expected to start becoming educated, and the literacy rate declined. In 1901, the U.S. Steel Corporation brought 158 companies with a capitalization of 1.4 billion, 3 times what the federal government made or spent. We also started to see urbanization in the development of the middle class. Industrialization of America led to the growth of large cities. Some of the reasons why is, you have where a lot of your population is. That's where a lot of immigrants were. So you could, in a sense, maybe hire people at cheaper rates. And these dominated the nation's economic, political, and cultural life. And again, we saw the development of the middle class. We also saw the rise of cities in 1900. 60% of the population of the nation's 12 largest cities were foreign born. So, we started to see kind of a cramming of residents in an area. And, I live in one of those, what do you call them? Multi-housing complexes. I have a condo, right? Or a townhome. I don't even know what the difference is. I think a townhome is since it's 3 stories, I think that's why it's considered.
I have a condo that's a 3-story.
Okay, what's the difference? Is there really a difference? I never really.
I can look it up real quick.
Yeah.
I know.
Just curiosity wise, not anything important.
I think townhomes have less building or less units per building.
Okay.
They're like 2 to 4, whereas condos tend to be more, but I'm not
okay.
Sure.
Yeah, if that's the definition, then yeah, I live in a condo then, because I'm looking out my window right now and across the way it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 units in one building, and they're all 3-story going up and down. But not have to worry about our yard because we don't have one.
Yeah, okay, so it's apparently the difference is a townhome is considered to be an attached home, whereas a condo is considered to be essentially an apartment that's owned.
Okay. It's splitting hairs, you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it serves the same purpose.
Yeah, I think it has to do with how many shared walls you have on average or something.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, there's
Okay.
one other thing. Townhouses own the entire building, whereas condos only own the inside.
Okay. Okay, so we also started to see juvenile delinquency and crime, also disease and death. One way to check the prosperity of a country is to look at its infant mortality rate. In your more underdeveloped countries, the infant mortality rate is going to be higher. And if we look here on the slide, it says in one Chicago district in the 1900s, 3 of every 5 babies died before their first birthday. A lot of it is kind of, I don't want to say negligent, but maybe unawareness of prenatal care, which is really important. Just kind of throwing out there, obviously medicine was in advance. We also had that concept of that Adam Smith laissez-faire economics, which means hands off the economy. And basically, we have that invisible hand theory where that hand guides how the economy goes. And we're supposed to work in jobs that are best suited for our talents. But if we look at the other side, the gap between the rich and the poor expanded. And 1% of the population owned most of the wealth. And this produced, this industrialization kind of produced sharp and unpredictable swings between prosperity, recession, and depression. Recession is much like what we had in 2008. We'll talk about the depression of 1929 in a future class. This is kind of where we have, a lot of unemployment, but relatively low inflation. Now, you don't want high unemployment and high inflation. That's hyperinflation. That's a really bad thing.
That's Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and inflation is basically the cost of goods and services rise. So if you go to Bonds and want to buy a gallon of milk and it's say it's $3.50, then you go back a month later and it's $4.50. That's an example of inflation that goods price increased. Working conditions were bad, 60-hour work weeks. 1 million people suffered some type of industrial accident. There wasn't really any laws in place. Definitely no overtime laws. Children were working. 1.7 million children under the age of 16 work full time for about 12 cents a day. And unions weren't really in play during this time. At this time, unions only had about 12% of the workforce. Unions are interesting because at this time, unions made up probably about 12% of the workforce. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, they made up about 60% of the workforce. Now we are probably back up to 12% of the workforce is unionized. And when we get into that, we'll talk a little bit about that later when we get into a little bit more of the economic stuff, and we'll talk about unions and how a lot of things that have happened to unions have been caused by outsourcing jobs, or in a sense, making some of these things like non-negotiable, like, 8 hours out, overtime after 8 hours, things that are laws that unions used to try to fight for, but now are placed in laws. And now you just have unions who are out there collective bargaining. And if you want a really good real world example of the effects of unions and employers, check out what's going on with baseball right now, right? Spring training is actually supposed to start pretty soon, but the owners have locked the players out because they don't have a collective bargaining agreement. And, when you have a collective bargaining agreement, 2 things can happen. One, the workers, they can go on strike and they won't work until that contract is renewed. I just had an experience with that probably about a month ago where the people that pick up the trash in my area went on strike. So, and I live near a canyon. So, and I live in a condo, so I have a dumpster that we go through our trash in. So people were starting to, the trash wasn't being picked up and it wasn't being collected. So it was gathering and people, the bins were full. So people just started throwing their bags of trash on in front of the dumpster, which isn't a good idea living next to a canyon. Because guess what's coming out of that canyon into my complex?
Updraft?
No,
Wind?
that coyotes. Yeah, the
Oh,
wind too. The wind too. Yeah, that's a good point because it wasn't, it wasn't the
the
most
smell.
the smell, but also
Yeah.
the danger of the coyotes. And I have a small to medium sized dog, so I just would never let him out at night. Just things like that. Women, 20% of all women over the age of 15 were employed. Women were expected to be subordinate and ignored, cold and passive, and you couldn't take or give family planning advice. That was illegal and immoral, even if people were married. Southern blacks were subject to arrest virtually at the whim of white law enforcement officers. See, Eric, this is the CRT part where I would get in trouble if I was teaching this in Alabama or something like that. Just kidding. But I think it's important to know African Americans were disenfranchised. It's just a part of our history that we have to recognize and accept.
Well, the system was basically set up so that they were a free labor pool as long as they had some
Right.
contact with the law.
Right. And even now, and we can get into this when we get into talking about the judicial branch. One of the things that has really affected the United States is the privatization of prisons. So keep that in mind.
Started on that one.
Yeah, keep that in mind, and we'll have a good discussion about that. We'll save that one for when we're meeting face to face, because that is something that really, really burns me. I don't like the privatization of prisons. And that basically means a private company is running a prison as opposed to the government. So a private company's whole goal is to make as much money as they can, right? So they're going to want their prison beds filled. What's that?
To create shareholder value.
Right. And one way to do that is keep your beds full. So we'll talk more about that when we get to that in the judicial part of this class. Native Americans were largely defeated, impoverished, dependent people pushed onto reservations. We'll talk about this more too when we get into civil rights. Mexicans, about 100,000 people of Mexican birth lived in California in the Southwest. They were scorned for their culture, religion, language, exploited by employers eager for cheap labor and shuttered into slums. And, we can still probably see aspects of this today, to be honest with you. I think you can maybe even change that from Mexicans to Mexicans and Central Americans as well, because a lot of immigration is not just coming from Mexico, it's coming from Central American countries that have some instability. We have the spoils system. We're going to talk more about that next week. The spoils system was a system where, say, for instance, I was running for mayor and you were my supporters and I won. Then I would all give you jobs in my administration. But then again, you would have to give me 10% of your salary to show that you're loyal. Basically the spoils system, right? We talked about that.
Sort of like keep me in office and I'll make sure that you don't get that you get a pardon.
Right. Yep. It's going to be interesting. It's really going to be interesting if President Trump gets elected in 2024, and if he decides to pardon a lot of these January 6th people. It'd be really interesting. Election fraud was common, right? Ballot boxes were stuffed, blacks were kept from voting. And then we move into progressive era, where we'll talk more about this next Wednesday, where a lot of these kind of industries and business people and all of this were kind of put on notice that we need to find ways to get rid of corruption and get rid of social Darwinism. And we'll talk more about this on Wednesday. Questions, concerns, or comments? Okay, right now I'm gonna go ahead and take any questions you have about the exam. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and throw them out. Are there any questions? You can even jump on the
I have a
mic or
question.
type. Yeah, go ahead.
So for the exam, I think you already had said this, but I just wanted to double check to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. With the study guide you posted, if we just fill out the study guide, and kind of know everything that's on the study guide, we should be okay for the exam.
Yeah, and that video, the video that I posted will help you fill out that study guide too.
Okay.
So use the combination of the PowerPoints, the video, and the study guide.
Okay, thank you.
And then let me know if you have any questions, like if something doesn't make sense, email me as soon as you can.
All right, thank you.
Is the format short answer, multiple choice?
So multiple choice, I think there's a handful of true false, but I think it's less than 5. And normally what I do to everybody is if you have, I don't want to say a disagreement or a question about a question, email it to me. All right. Because, you know, as teachers, I always try to evolve also. And if a question goes out there that a lot of people get wrong, then I have to reevaluate the way I teach it. Now, if there's a question out there that you all interpret differently than I do, that's another thing that I have to look at. So if you have any questions, write them down, email them to me, and then I usually go in and check. There's instances where I throw questions out if a lot of people don't do well on them, or if I reflect back and don't think it's a good question. So I usually do that a couple of days after everybody has taken the exam so I can go over the stats. But yeah, just come prepared. Just don't overthink. Don't stress. You have an hour and 50 minutes. If you get locked out, just go ahead and email me. I should be able to get you back in the system pretty quickly. Do y'all have any other questions about the content of the exam? Remember, it's going to be everything from January 24th up until now. Okay, if there's no questions, we're going to go ahead and get out of here a little earlier. I'm happy with the way the class went today. We're about 20 minutes early, but I owe you 20 minutes of my life. So we'll go ahead and stop here. And then next Wednesday, we'll pick up talking about about the progressive era. So remember, Monday, we just have the exam. You don't have to sign on to the Zoom, but I'll be on there still. There's a Zoom link that's open in the Zoom chat forum. So I'll be on, I'll have my computer on in case you want to come in and talk to me. If I'm not around, just holler out for me. I might be doing other stuff. So if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and end the session. Any other questions, comments, or concerns? Okay, everybody, give me about an hour to get this up. I should have this up in the next few hours to YouTube. All right. So have a good rest of your day. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy Super Bowl weekend. It's always fun to tell people who aren't from the United States that Super Bowl is kind of a holiday here in the United States because everybody gets together and watches it. So have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank
Thank you, Professor. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Hi, Prof.
See you later. See you later.